The air was thick with smoke as Sarah Parker turned onto the suburban highway, heading to her friend's house. The young librarian had no idea that this scorching November day in 2019 would change her life forever. For weeks, wildfires had surrounded the small Australian town of Port Macquarie, but that day, the wind turned glowing embers into a raging inferno. Through the windshield of her old Holden, Sarah spotted an eerie orange glow ahead. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, her heart pounding like a drum. Thick black smoke filled the sky, distorting reality into something nightmarish. Burning leaves slammed against her windshield, flickering like tiny fireballs before vanishing. The dashboard glowed red from the encroaching flames, and the thermometer read an unbearable 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Slamming on the brakes, Sarah jumped out of the car. The blistering air stung her skin as she struggled to see through the smoke and embers. And then she saw him. Clinging desperately to the charred trunk of a eucalyptus tree, about 10 feet up, was a small koala. His huge brown eyes reflected the flickering flames, and a low, almost human-like whimper escaped his throat. His singed fur exposed raw, blistered skin, and his tiny claws dug into the blackened bark, leaving dark streaks behind. Without hesitation, Sarah yanked off her cotton shirt, now just in her tank top, and soaked the fabric with water from her bottle. The fire was closing in, trees crackling as flames consumed them. Burning branches rained down like deadly missiles. "Hold on, little one," she called, coughing through the thick smoke. "I'm going to get you out of here." Every step toward the tree was a battle. The heat was suffocating, her lungs burned and her eyes stung. She reached the base of the tree and realized she had no choice but to climb. Pressing her palms against the scorching bark, she gritted her teeth against the pain and pulled herself up, ignoring the blisters forming on her hands. The nauseating stench of burnt fur filled her nose. The koala, whom she would later name Charlie, seemed to understand she was there to help. Defying his usual skittish nature, he allowed her to wrap him in the damp shirt. But climbing down was even harder. With one arm wrapped around the trembling koala, she struggled to find her footing. Then a massive burning branch crashed to the ground nearby. The impact shook the tree and Sarah lost her balance. She fell nearly 3 feet, instinctively curling around Charlie to protect him from the hard landing. The veterinary clinic was a war zone. The waiting room overflowed with injured animals, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic, burnt fur, and desperation. Exhausted veterinarians and nurses rushed between cages, their white coats stained with soot and blood. Second and third degree burns, severe dehydration, smoke inhalation, Dr. Wilson muttered as he examined Charlie. His hands trembled from exhaustion, dark circles framing his eyes. The next 48 hours will be critical. Honestly, his chances aren't great. The next 2 weeks became an endless blur for Sarah. She refused to leave Charlie's side, sleeping in a stiff chair by his cage, leaving only to shower and change. Her library supervisor, touched by her dedication, granted her unpaid leave without hesitation. On the 10th night, disaster struck. Charlie's fever spiked, and his tiny body convulsed. "Septic shock," Dr. Wilson said grimly, quickly administering antibiotics. Sarah knelt beside the cage, whispering prayers to any god who would listen, promising anything if he would just survive. His body trembled violently, his lungs struggled for air, and pink foam gathered at his lips. The heart monitor's frantic beeping slowed. Then silence. His heart had stopped. For 40 agonizing seconds, Sarah held her breath. Then a weak but steady beat. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Charlie opened his tired brown eyes and weakly reached a paw toward Sarah through the bars. Dr. Wilson called it a miracle, but Sarah knew the truth. It was love that had brought him back. When Charlie was finally strong enough to leave the clinic, the vets confirmed he would never survive in the wild. Without a second thought, Sarah took him home. Their fates were intertwined now. The first week at home was rough. Charlie flinched at every noise, cowered at open windows, and woke up screaming at night, reliving the nightmare of the fire. Sarah set up a cozy corner with soft platforms and artificial trees, but he refused to leave his carrier, his only safe space. The neighbors weren't exactly welcoming. Mrs. Jenkins, the neighborhood busybody, launched a campaign against the wild animal, collecting signatures and calling authorities. She even summoned the police, claiming she heard threatening sounds from Sarah's house. Everything changed one rainy evening when Mrs. Jenkins suffered a heart attack. Sarah was the only one who heard her cries for help. As paramedics wheeled the elderly woman away, she weakly grasped Sarah's hand. "Take care of my orchids," she whispered. For 3 weeks, Sarah tended the flowers, and Charlie took an unexpected interest in them, watching over them from his perch. When Mrs. Jenkins returned and saw her beloved orchids thriving, her attitude shifted. Soon, she was offering Sarah cookies and knitting tiny blankets for Charlie. The biggest breakthrough came when Mr. O'Brien's granddaughter, Lucy, wandered into Sarah's yard. Instead of shooing her away, Sarah invited her to meet Charlie. The koala, surprisingly gentle, let the little girl pet him and even took a eucalyptus leaf from her hand. When Mr. O'Brien stormed into the yard, ready to scold Sarah, he froze. His granddaughter sat on a soft blanket, excitedly telling Charlie a bedtime story about 3 bears. That moment changed everything. Then tragedy struck. One morning, Sarah got a call from London. Her mother had passed away. The world blurred into a gray haze. She stopped eating, stopped caring, drowning in grief. But Charlie wouldn't let her disappear. Every morning, he nudged her awake with his warm nose, refusing to eat until she did. When she cried, he pressed against her, making soft, soothing noises. Over time, they healed together. Charlie's burns faded, new fur grew, and he slowly learned to move around with confidence. Sarah, too, changed. The shy librarian who once kept to herself now stood tall, speaking at schools about conservation and animal care. Their story spread throughout the town, inspiring others to do good. Their home became a sanctuary, filled with eucalyptus trees planted by Mrs. Jenkins and an irrigation system installed by Mr. O'Brien. On hot days, Charlie lounged in his air-conditioned corner, gazing at a small fountain as if pondering the twists of fate. Every evening, Sarah and Charlie sat by the window, watching the sun set. She would tell him about her day, and he would listen, occasionally placing a tiny paw on her hand. In those quiet moments, she reflected on the fire that changed everything. One impulsive decision had led to an unbreakable bond. She had saved Charlie from the flames, and he had saved her from the darkness. Their story became a living testament that love and compassion could transcend species, and sometimes you have to walk through the fire to find your way home.